I will do my level best to stand up for freedom and democracy around the world by keeping the United States of America strong and by keeping our eyes wide open as we welcome change in the world, but keeping our eyes wide open.
President Ike for President Ike for President, you like Ike, I like.
In January 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower began his first term, and finally the CIA, China lobby, and defense industry had a fully sympathetic president to their shared policy vision. Although Eisenhower appointed John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State and Allen Dulles as Director of the CIA, two strong adherents of a policy of rollback, his administration took a measured course in Asia, choosing to prioritize a policy of massive foreign aid campaigns to bolster Washington's client states against their communist neighbors. In 1954, the French lost in Indochina, despite the CIA's Civil Air Transport airline aiding the French war effort at Dien Bien Phu. This was also despite the Eisenhower administration's massive financial support of the war, reaching a peak of $400 million in the last year of the colonial campaign. With the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu and the creation of 4 new states in the subcontinent, Washington was thrust into Southeast Asia, quickly embedding themselves into South Vietnam and Laos, as I've covered in the last 2 videos of the Secret War in Laos series. As much as the Eisenhower White House committed itself to entrenching the US in the subcontinent, the administration avoided a full-on US military presence, despite clamoring for such from the hawkish voices in DC. Eisenhower instead prioritized his policy vision codenamed the New Look, which sought to prioritize the development of a massive arsenal of tactical nuclear weapons as a deterrent to further Soviet and Chinese military efforts in the Third World. This policy would see a dramatic increase in the US's nuclear arsenal, and the beginnings of ongoing calls by the most hawkish voices in foreign policy blob advocating for the use of nuclear weapons in quote limited capacities throughout the world. No, this was seriously an ongoing policy recommendation throughout the early Cold War. For example, General MacArthur suggested that Truman use limited nuclear weapons in Korea to cut off the North, a suggestion that he luckily never resorted to. And during Vietnam, it was an almost monthly occurrence that the president would be recommended by some general or foreign policy expert to use tactical nukes as conventional weapons. Figures such as US presidential candidate Barry Goldwater in 1964 would continue to advocate the use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam throughout the campaign, somehow making his opponent Lyndon Johnson look like the dove. In the 1950s, the Hawks were prepared to use any means necessary to enact their policy of rollback, as the Eisenhower White House, publicly anyways, continued a similar policy of containment as his predecessor. Ike's foreign policy, especially in Asia, was focused on providing massive financial and military aid to allied proxy states in critical areas. These included the governments of Thailand and Laos, and of course, the government of Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Nhu in South Vietnam. This overt US funding was paired with covert military assistance missions in specifically South Vietnam and Laos, led often by the CIA. Again, I have covered the CIA missions in South Vietnam and the CIA coups in Laos throughout the 1950s in detail in parts 3 and 4 of my Secret War in Laos series, if you want more details. Though to summarize very quickly, by taking a hands-off role from Southeast Asia and delegating authority to the intelligence community, Ike allowed the spies to control the narrative and political situation on the ground in these hotspots, and to further spur official US intervention in the critical subcontinent. First, it was in Laos, where the CIA would continuously plot to put a clique of drug-smuggling generals in charge of the country. Next, as Ngo Dinh Diem's regime began to collapse in the early 1960s, and as we'll see later in this documentary, the CIA would once again be involved in his overthrow and further spurring of US support. But as it stood in 1954, instead of committing the full force of the US military into Southeast Asia, the Eisenhower foreign policy apparatus turned towards the Rockefellers' domain of Latin America, where rollback policies would be implemented with a heavy hand. The interim period between the French Indochina War and the American Vietnam War saw the gathering of the future operators in Vietnam and Laos, gathering not in Asia, but in Latin America. In many ways, Ike's policy of rollback in the Caribbean and Central America would serve as critical training for the future CIA and Special Forces teams that would undertake the secret war in Laos and Vietnam a decade later. Although Eisenhower's 8 years in the White House did not lead to any significant overt U.S. military engagements or outright American-led wars, rollback did in fact still manifest itself through Eisenhower's preferred tactic to repeal the advance of Third World nationalism and socialism, and that was the widespread use of CIA-backed coups. Eisenhower allowed the Central Intelligence Agency to run largely autonomously, with very little oversight and very few red lines. In a 1975 hearing at the Senate Assassination Committee, former Undersecretary of State C. Douglas Dillon stated that the CIA under Allen Dulles did not report on assassinations to the president, claiming that Dulles, quote, felt very strongly that we should not involve the president directly in things of this nature, end quote. And in return, Ike would allegedly order the CIA to do, quote, whatever is necessary, end quote, to counter the CIA's reported threat of communist advances in the Western Hemisphere. Overall, the U.S. intelligence community was allowed to operate without any restraint during the 8 years of Eisenhower's presidency. This free reign could be attributed to many factors, either Eisenhower's trust in American institutions, his primary focus on domestic policy, or, maybe most compellingly, the influence of his omnipresent Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. You see, John Foster Dulles, seen as a preeminent statesman and diplomat, could have easily swayed Eisenhower to put his full trust in his brother Allen Dulles, then director of the CIA's work. Importantly, however, the freedom afforded to the Central Intelligence Agency during the 1950s led to some of the most criminal and devastating operations of their early history, such as numerous coups of democratically elected leaders, a massive expansion of their paramilitary capabilities, and of course a further deployment of the infamous MK-Ultra brainwashing program, an offshoot of other such brainwashing programs such as Artichoke and Bluebird, developed under the Truman administration. Eisenhower's inherent trust and hands-off approach taken towards his spy agency would be solidified as the CIA quickly delivered results. First in Iran in 1953, when the agency worked to overthrow the democratically elected government of nationalist leader Mohammad Mossadegh, and to reinstall the demagogic pro-Western Shah, all in order to secure Anglo-American oil interests. During the Eisenhower years, which could be considered the golden age of CIA-backed coups and regime change operations, the Covert Operations Center of the agency was run by none other than Deputy Director of Plans Frank Wisner. A former OSS agent and an old boy in the CIA, Wisner brought a level of cunning and ruthless efficiency to his regime change operations that were only possible due to Eisenhower's complete hands-off approach and the lack of effective oversight mechanisms in place at the time. Wisner's imperialist global program allowed Eisenhower to lean heavily on the agency's operating arm to roll back the apparent rise of socialism across the globe and to avoid major military confrontations. Maybe the most relevant of these operations to our current study today was interestingly not in Asia, but in Central America, Operation PBSuccess in Guatemala. The CIA coup in Guatemala in 1954 was a watershed moment for the agency, and unsurprisingly, also for the China lobby. The coup in Guatemala specifically was orchestrated on behalf of the United Fruit Company, a near-monopolistic American firm in Guatemala that was feeling threatened by the land reform policies being implemented by the democratically elected Jacobo Arbenz government. Arbenz, who in retrospect was by no means a hardened communist and resembled more of a third world nationalist than anything else, was seriously pushing for the nationalization and redistribution of United Fruit Company's immense domain by 1954. The successful coup, codenamed Operation PBSuccess, which followed a failed CIA plot codenamed PB Fortune a year earlier, would see the China lobby re-emerge, working this time on an entirely different continent, but for similar interests. Through the Guatemalan episode in 1954, it becomes clear that the China lobby only represented one coat of paint for an amorphous and pervasive American ruling class seeking to forward capital and anti-communism across the globe. The plot to overthrow the democratically elected government of Arbenz originated with the powerful United Fruit Company, working in DC to lobby for American support of regime change in their Central American fiefdom. To push their agenda through the halls of power, they hired as a lobbyist none other than Tommy the Cork Cochran, the China lobby lawyer now shifting towards Latin America. Getting the ball rolling, Tommy sent several letters to President Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers on the company's behalf, urging the government to orchestrate a pro-Western coup in Guatemala City. The Dulles brothers were more than happy to help, given their former law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, counted the United Fruit Company as one of their most significant clients. Both CIA Director Allen Dulles and his predecessor Walter Beadle Smith, who planned the failed Operation PB Fortune before Dulles entered the scene, would find their way on the United Fruit Company's board of directors once the dust settled from the successful coup. The revolving door never stopped spinning. Another prominent member of Eisenhower's foreign policy machine at the time was none other than Nelson Rockefeller, who Ike had brought in as a special assistant on foreign policy in 1954. Famously, the Rockefeller dynasty was deeply involved in Latin American oil interests, clearly threatened by the nationalization push of politicians such as Arbenz. This interest group, which included external lobbyists such as Tommy the Cork and internal high-level Eisenhower government officials such as the Dulles brothers and Nelson Rockefeller, has been described by political scientist Suzanne Jonas as, quote, part of a broad network of power on Wall Street and in Washington that included or had ties with nearly all interest groups involved in foreign policy formation. On its own board and through its law firms, banks, etc., the United Fruit Company integrated the principal Eastern groups, the Rockefellers, Standard Oil Interests, the Morgans, and the Boston Blue Bloods, which dominated the foreign policy apparatus, end quote. With such a coalition of capital opposing Arbenz's program, it is unsurprising that he stood little chance against rollback policy of the CIA and the Blue Bloods. To help bring the coup together, Allen Dulles and the CIA tapped associates from the China lobby. One such figure was Whiting Willauer, co-founder of Civil Air Transport, who had recently been appointed to be the ambassador of the neighboring country of Honduras. Willauer worked to allow CIA-financed mercenaries and dissident members of the Guatemalan Armed Forces, which worked to invade the country on the day of the coup, to station in his Honduras. The former CAT executive was also helpful in procuring pilots for the CIA's crack force. According to a CIA-issued history of PBSuccess written in 1994, which I linked below, Willauer was able to procure pilots for Castillo Armas's coup forces on contract from Civil Air Transport, paying them some $2,000 a month and a $250 bonus for each successful mission. As the history paper states, quote, Willauer rounded up a motley assortment of bush pilots, ex-military flyers, and expatriate barnstormers with names like, end quote. And then the report is, of course, redacted. This CIA Air Force allegedly flew out of an airfield in Managua, Nicaragua, under the approval of Nicaraguan dictator and good friend of US capital, Anastasio Somoza. As it goes, many future CIA pilots have been rumored to have gotten their start in Operation PBSuccess, dropping anti-Arbenz pamphlets over Guatemala City and providing air support to the CIA's coup forces. This even came to include bombing Guatemala City on the days around the coup. Part of the funding of these activities reportedly came from none other than millionaire William Pawley, a China lobby financier who would also come to fund the Bay of Pigs invasion later down the line. Together, the white-collar Yanks pulled it off, and their chosen man, Castillo Armas, was brought into the capital, surrounded by his CIA-financed forces. Operation PBSuccess would in many ways serve as an unofficial dry run for the much larger Bay of Pigs invasion to be undertaken 7 years later. Many of the same CIA men and many of the same corporate interests would re-emerge for the doomed Cuban operation. In Langley, in 1954, Frank Wisner put Richard Bissell, an OSS old boy and covert operator from the former Office of Policy Coordination, in charge of planning PBSuccess. Bissell would of course later be tapped to plan the Bay of Pigs operation on behalf of Allen Dulles and Richard Nixon in 1960. On the ground in Guatemala, Bissell entrusted top spook E. Howard Hunt with one of his first major significant covert operations since his time in the OSS under none other than Paul Helliwell in China during World War II. Hunt had previously been posted at the Mexico City CIA station, which for the purposes of PBSuccess would run a propaganda radio station, announcing the imminent downfall of President Arbenz in Guatemala, far before any action even took place. Hunt's appointment to the PBSuccess team marked yet another cross-cutting link between the Guatemalan coup and the China lobby nexus, but also the future Anti-Castro Operations, which saw Hunt training Cuban guerrilla fighters at a CIA training facility in none other than Guatemala. These links are not merely coincidental. What PBSuccess achieved in successfully ousting Jacobo Arbenz and installing CIA-supported strongman Castillo Armas was a pure manifestation of rollback. The overlap of China lobby aviation interests, Rockefeller oil interests, and Latin American banana interests is emblematic of the international nature of elite groupings, and how a clique like the China lobby can be applied as a pressure group through such forces as Tommy the Cork and William Pawley, for example, in seemingly unrelated activities across the globe, all in the service of Western capital. The Guatemalan episode, despite its roaring success for the American ruling class, brought with it widespread condemnation and opposition from the people of Latin America, as charges of Yankee imperialism and frustration at outdated Monroe Doctrine policies were heard throughout the region. Guatemala, following the installation of Castillo Armas by the CIA, would remain the domain of the United Fruit Company for the time being. The country would also serve as a beachhead for U.S. foreign policy and illegal activity. Guatemala City was soon to be filled with American mob-owned casinos, established according to Peter Dale Scott by Meyer Lansky representatives, and most prominently, New Orleans crime boss Carlos Marcello. Marcello, who would play a prominent role in the CIA's future Anti-Castro Operations, would establish his second base of operation in Guatemala. In 1958, 4 years after PBSuccess, Scott points out that the CIA operator Howard Hunt was spotted back in Guatemala City, this time to attend the Regional Conference of the Anti-Communist Federation, a CIA front group that sought to unite local anti-communist forces through informal alliances and partnerships. The chairman of that same conference was Carlos Marcello's lawyer, Antonio Valadares, showing the early stages of the confluence of interests between the CIA and the inherently anti-communist National Crime Syndicate. These anti-communist networks would gain increased prominence and importance as Castillo Armas was assassinated by his Guard Corps in 1957. And in 1960, the country would be plunged into a 3 decades-long civil war, culminating in the US-backed Guatemalan genocide throughout the 1970s and 80s. As Eisenhower's foreign policy apparatus continued to covertly roll back undesirable governments across the Third World, as would be done in Iran, Guatemala, and starting in 1958 in Laos, the military-industrial complex, coming off their Truman-era high during the Korean War, began to clamor for more overt U.S. foreign interventions. This is where we get to another elite network that operated in close proximity to the China lobby, and what I'll be calling the Rockefeller Network. The Rockefellers had for years been intimately involved in both Asia and Latin America. On the Asian front, the Rockefellers had been invested in China since the mid-1910s through their China Medical Board under the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefellers had since the turn of the century provided critical forums and lobbies for elite interests and patricians to develop policy and to network. Most famous and arguably most influential of these Rockefeller-dominated spaces was the Council on Foreign Relations, which they provided the majority of the funding for from the 1930s onwards. Throughout our story today, chances are that if you think back to a character that I've discussed, they were probably at some point or in some capacity invited or a member of the CFR. The Council on Foreign Relations to this day remains the central piece of many theories on elite domination or shadow governments, as its membership and directorship remains a who's who of the business, intelligence, and military-industrial spheres. I encourage you, if you haven't already, to simply pull up the Wikipedia page for current and former CFR members, and to casually scroll through the list. It really is a seemingly endless list of plutocrats, spooks, and politicians all meeting in secret behind closed doors. In the post-war era, the Rockefeller clan was headed by 5 brothers, the 5 sons of John D. Rockefeller II, himself the son and heir of the illustrious Standard Oil fortune. 4 of these brothers would all in some capacity come to shape the US's Cold War policy in Asia and push for the increased militarization of the US economy throughout the 1950s and 60s. First, you had the eldest brother, John D. Rockefeller III. John III would help the family manage the substantial philanthropic networks they had been handed down from their father, while also creating new channels for Rockefeller funds to influence politics around the globe. On top of taking the leadership spot in the China Medical Board, John was also active on the Council of Foreign Relations. And, for the purposes of our story today, John founded the Asia Society in 1956, based originally in New York City. The Asia Society sought to create an open forum for American business interests to meet and network with Asian political and business leaders. According to Peter Dale Scott, John III's Asia Society acted as a forum for both No Dinh Diem and the Thai political elite in the 1950s to come to the United States. Also in the early 1960s, Scott remarked that the Asia Society hosted several executives of the oil firm Sakoni Mobil, who advocated for direct U.S. intervention in Southeast Asia at the time. Sakoni Mobil would be renamed to Mobil in 1966 and eventually, in 1999, would be known as it is today, as the giant ExxonMobil. Accordingly, oil exploration in the South China Sea was gaining prominence during this era, with significant reserves off the coast of Thailand and Cambodia eyed up by Western oil firms. It is maybe unsurprising then that in 1968, 4 years into the Vietnam War, offshore drilling activity in the South China Sea had already doubled since the pre-war period. Oil and gas interests are very rarely mentioned when discussing the Vietnam War. Yet they remained intimately invested in further integration of the US into the subcontinent, especially as the Communist North threatened the promising oil reserves off the coast of the US client in the South. The Rockefellers, for their part, naturally had always been heavily invested in the oil industry, through offshoots of their Standard Oil legacy, such as the previously mentioned Sakoni Mobil. These investments were largely managed by the two youngest Rockefeller brothers, Lawrence and David, the two primary financiers for the dynasty. David Rockefeller, the youngest, was famously an executive and later the chairman and CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank throughout the 1970s. With Chase's close associations to oil interests, and David's cozy relationship with future national security advisors and government officials, most famously, of course, being Harvard professor Henry Kissinger, it's not a stretch to imagine that the family would do all they could to expand U.S. oil exploration off the coast of a capitalist South Vietnam. This fact is further reinforced by the second youngest brother, financier Lawrence Rockefeller. Lawrence was primarily focused on managing the Rockefellers' inherited wealth through the establishment of one of the first post-war venture capital firms, founded in 1946, called Rockefeller Brothers, Inc. Not to be confused with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund or the Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Inc., or RBI for short, would be reformed into the now famous Venrock Capital in 1969. RBI, however, remains a murky venture that is very difficult to find any concrete information on. But from my research, which was extensive, and I had to do actually quite a deep dive to get to this, I will assert that it appears that Lawrence Rockefeller's RBI was some sort of intelligence front, or at the very least a way for the Rockefellers to liaise with the CIA and associated interests. Let me explain. RBI became known as a primary investor in military technology firms, specifically in aerospace and aviation. RBI's initial partners in 1946 unsurprisingly included the 5 Rockefeller brothers and their sister Abigail. However, RBI also included 2 additional silent partners that would remain close associates to Lawrence throughout his early career. The first was a man named Harper Woodward, who had worked in military procurement at the Pentagon during the war. Harper Woodward, as it turned out, and get ready for this, was actually an early director of Civil Air Transport, the CIA-owned airline in the Far East, linking the China lobby to Rockefeller interests, but also placing a CIA employee into the Rockefeller financial web. The other silent partner was one Thaddeus Walkowitz, an MIT aerospace engineer who had spent 11 years at the Air Force. These military-industrial complex figures, mainly Woodward and Walkowitz, would go on to found the intelligence technology firm known as Itek, with RBI funding. According to Peter Dale Scott, Itek would develop various technologies for the CIA, including spy satellite components and cameras for the U-2 spy plane, representing a key piece of the electronic intelligence boom. This may be a good time for a quick aside, just to mention that Lawrence Rockefeller would go on to fund several UFO enthusiast conferences and panels in the 1980s and 90s, working essentially to divert the UFO community's attention away from experimental military tech, by the way, a field that he was very invested in, and towards unproven alien tech. Given Lawrence's closeness to intelligence and the defense industry, I would speculate that his funding of UFO groups was working within the confines of a pre-existing psychological operation to divert attention away from encounters of experimental military tech. Anyways, returning to the 1950s, interestingly, the CIA's spy plane program and the spy satellite programs, which incidentally were the main procurers of Itek hardware in the early days, were directed by one Richard Bissell. You'll remember him as the man who organized Operation PBSuccess in Guatemala in service of Rockefeller interests, and he would later organize the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. We see here that Lawrence Rockefeller's RBI served as essentially an intelligence front to help fund and profit off of the intelligence complex that was being deployed in the escalating Cold War. Furthermore, CIA integration into the Rockefeller Network, and vice versa, once again illustrates the symbiotic relationship between intelligence and private capital, as both work to reinforce each other and to push each other's goals. Now, the main reason I bring up the Rockefeller interests is to highlight their legacy on US policy in Southeast Asia. In 1940, years before Southeast Asia was an American concern, the Rockefeller brothers, led primarily by Lawrence Rockefeller, founded the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Again, not to be confused with the Rockefeller Foundation or Rockefeller's Brothers Inc., the Rockefeller Brothers Fund was positioned as a philanthropic organization to be used by the brothers to support causes they believed in. In reality, however, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund would turn into a massive lobbying effort, a private think tank set on institutionalizing the perpetual war economy and military Keynesianism through the development of the Special Studies Project. Running from 1956 to 1960, the Rockefeller-funded panel sought to clarify national objectives for the new post-war era. The project was led by Nelson Rockefeller, who assembled a team of academics, business executives, and corporate journalists to draft 6 reports on different areas of US policy. Nelson Rockefeller, the lead on the project, had served in the Eisenhower White House as a special assistant to the president, as I stated earlier, and had been one of the main voices advocating for the massive military aid regime that the Eisenhower admin rolled out in Southeast Asia. When Nelson resigned in 1955, allegedly due to apparent sidelining by the CIA and National Security Council, he shifted to heading the private Special Studies Project. The Special Studies Project, which was to be entirely co-directed by both Nelson and the up-and-coming Harvard professor Henry Kissinger, who at the time remained largely unknown, would be split into 6 major panels. Kissinger, of course, would go on to be Nixon's bloodthirsty national security advisor and a major architect of the Southeast Asian bombing campaign, which have been clearly reassessed as war crimes. The Special Studies Project, where Kissinger largely entered the spotlight in the late 1950s, set the agenda for the next decade or so of high-level government policy. Specifically, it was Panel 2, titled International Security, the Military Aspect, which would end up being the most consequential, and was the only panel that was directed specifically by Kissinger himself. Panel 2 counted as fellow panelists the following. Firstly, Skull and Bones member Henry Luce, of Time Life fame, of course, but also, as we covered extensively, a prominent China lobbyist. Also, Lawrence Rockefeller, as well as future Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Gilpatrick, and finally, another Bonesman, future Undersecretary of the Air Force from 1967 to 69 under President Johnson, one Townsend Hoops. Now, I do have to note here that this is but 5 of the 20 named contributors to Panel 2 on international security. The rest of the list is a real who's who of military-industrial contractors, defense research fellows, and former military officers. Gordon Dean, for example, one of the named drafters, was vice president of nuclear energy at General Dynamics, a massive military-industrial complex concern in Texas, with direct ties to future President Lyndon Johnson, as we will see later down the line. On that same note is James B. Fisk, executive vice president of Bell Laboratories, another massive military-industrial R&D center. Regarding military R&D, on the panel were also Ellis Johnson, director at Johns Hopkins University, and former General James McCormack, vice president at MIT. Finally, also on the panel was another MIT researcher that we have covered before in this video, none other than Thaddeus Walkowitz, the silent partner in the Rockefeller Brothers Inc., with Lawrence Rockefeller, and a co-founder of Itek, the CIA-affiliated technology firm that did spy satellite technology and cameras for the U-2 spy planes. So, what we have here is an indisputable melding of the military-industrial sphere, the business community, the press corps, and future Johnson and Nixon administration officials. With that said, it is unsurprising that the highly influential panel came up with a policy platform that would serve their best interests, and future entrench the military-industrial economy into the post-war United States. Panel 2 reaffirmed many of the recommendations made by Paul Nitz several years earlier in his 1950 NSC 68 document. Panel 2 called for, quote, forces for limited war, or in other words, quote, to provide the mobile units essential for limited war. Additional troop lift should be authorized in the form of both modern aircraft and modern ships. The Army should be permitted to speed up the modernization of its weapons and of its division structure, end quote. The report unambiguously decries the reduction in military spending after the Korean War, and the apparent consequences of such peacetime military spending reductions. The report notes, quote, when the Korean War ended, it was natural that an effort be made to reduce military expenditures. But the execution of the reduction has had serious consequences, which did not become evident for some time because of a backlog of unspent appropriations, end quote. And it goes on to state, quote, recent military expenditures are therefore insufficient to maintain even our current force levels, and events have made clear the inadequacy of these levels, end quote. Essentially, the Rockefeller panel concludes that the US needed to return to Korean War-era military spending and to increase preparedness for quote-unquote limited wars, such as would become the future Vietnam War. It is unsurprising then that the Vietnam War would later be viewed by opponents of the conflict as a cynical effort to further bolster the military economy, with opposition figures such as Senator J. William Fulbright of Arkansas stating that business leaders and some politicians viewed the war as, quote, a nice little war, not too much killing, but a big help to the economy, end quote. The Rockefeller-Kissinger panel was stating in no uncertain terms the desire of the ruling class in the military-industrial complex for a limited war, with unlimited war spending. Despite all the pressure, Eisenhower would not be the one to initiate such a war, despite his last years in office setting the pieces for his successors to enter the subcontinent. While the Rockefeller Brother Fund was sponsoring the Special Studies Group in the late 1950s, the foreign policy and intelligence blobs were continuing their rollback efforts in both Latin America and Southeast Asia. Starting in 1958, in Laos, a country that Eisenhower had supported with millions of dollars of military aid, the CIA, with the help of their Civil Air Transport airline, worked to remove democratically elected Prime Minister Suvarnabhuma. This culminated in the CIA-backed coups in 1959 and 1960, which replaced the neutralist Suvarna government with a clique of Western-friendly opium smuggling generals. From this point onwards, the vast opium fields of northern Laos and Burma were controlled by CIA proxies. The Lao generals and Hmong forces in Laos, and the CIA-financed Thai Border Patrol and breakaway KMT forces in Burma, all of which would be facilitated by Civil Air Transport and later Air America in their narco-smuggling activities. With their clients in place, the steady stream of dark money was ready to flow from Southeast Asia. The American people would soon be made aware that Laos was being used as a bypass for North Vietnamese guerrilla fighters supplying the insurgency in South Vietnam, threatening the US-backed No Dinh Diem regime. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, as it would be called, emerged in 1959 and would lead Western journalists to decry an invasion crisis in Laos, requiring official US intervention. The first journalist to bring this story to the American people was none other than Joseph Alsop, who had 20 years earlier been embedded with Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers during the Chinese Civil War. Now, here he was, embedded in the CIA-supported Royal Lao Army, once again propagandizing for the China lobby. Peter Dale Scott also notes that as the CIA's Civil Air Transport began their airlift operations in Laos in 1959, the airlift would continue largely uninterrupted until the mid-1970s. Working to shuttle arms, supplies, and narcotics throughout Southeast Asia, the China Lobby Civil Air Transport, to be renamed to Air America in 1960, would benefit directly from increased U.S. presence in Southeast Asia, and a continued opium boom that was spurred largely by these conflicts in Laos. Peter Dale Scott also notes that this airlift operation and the expansion of activities in Southeast Asia was a, quote, godsend to PanAm and the other big U.S. airlines at the time when they were suffering badly, end quote. He continues, quote, Laos generated a need for additional military airlift, which, after considerable lobbying and threats of quitting international services, was awarded by contract to commercial carriers. Thanks to its Pacific operations, PanAm saw its charter revenues soar almost 300% in 4 years and showed a profit in 1961 for the first time since 1956, even though its Atlantic services continued to operate at a loss. This combined with the fact that PanAm was providing off-duty pilots and their older phased-out aircraft to CAT and later Air America, and as I've shown, several CAT directors also had direct and indirect ties to PanAm, or the wider aviation industry, it appeared that conspiring was afoot, especially in getting the US security state to take further action in Southeast Asia. In parallel, during this same period, CIA officials, China lobby heads, and mafia figures were conspiring to plan an invasion of Cuba, which would come to be known as, of course, the Bay of Pigs invasion. With closeted communist Fidel Castro firmly in control of Cuba in 1959, and following the new government's nationalization of foreign-owned businesses, including the mob-controlled casinos and resorts in the former US client state, the intelligence business community began to organize a new coup effort in the Caribbean, this time in Cuba. Fidel Castro's overthrow of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1958 sent shockwaves throughout the United States establishment. The Caribbean island had acted as a pseudo-colony to the US since their victory in the Spanish-American War over half a decade earlier. American business interests, and increasingly American organized crime, came to dominate the island's economy. Paradoxically, the CIA and the State Department had hedged their bets regarding Cuba over the final years of the increasingly unpopular and volatile Batista regime. During the Cuban Revolution, which lasted between roughly 1956 and 1958, the CIA funneled weapons and money to both Batista's regime and Castro's guerrilla forces in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Using unofficial CIA asset gun runners, the agency supported both sides of the conflict. Such gun runners, who got their start ferrying guns to Cuba in the revolutionary years, were, for example, Frank Sturgis, a future Bay of Pigs operative and later Watergate burglar. During this period, Frank Sturgis, who was known at the time as Frank Fiorini, or his birth name, was training Fidel's men in guerrilla warfare, skills acquired from his previous experience as a Marine during World War II, island hopping in the Pacific. He would later provide details regarding the combat training he gained while fighting with the Raiders, an elite contingent of Marines, in a 1978 testimony before the House Select Committee on Assassinations. There, Sturgis would state that the Raiders were trained to undertake, quote, behind-the-lines activities, for instance, assassinations, and infiltrating enemy encampments, end quote. This early guerrilla warfare training in the jungles of the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea would undoubtedly translate to the work he'd undertake first in arming and training Castro's forces, and later in training the CIA's Cuban exile guerrillas against him in the early 60s. Although never an official on-the-books employee of the agency, Sturgis would become an unofficial asset of several high-profile spooks. Most famous would be his proximity to E. Howard Hunt, a prime planner and paramilitary trainer during the Bay of Pigs, as we'll see later. According to some, Frank Fiorini decided to take on the pseudonym of Frank Sturgis based on the main character of one of Howard Hunt's pulp novels that he wrote in 1949, titled Bimini Run. The character in Hunt's story was Hank Sturgis, a character that, interestingly, mirrors Frank's life from the mid to late 40s. Accordingly, there have also been suggestions that Frank took on the alias of Sturgis from his stepfather's last name, which was also Sturgis. So, it appears that by naming his 1949 novel character Hank Sturgis, that Howard Hunt may have revealed that the two men's working relationship extended to a time far earlier than their initial partnerships in the Anti-Castro Operations, so to at least the time of the mid-1940s. Regardless of when the two men met, they would remain close partners in future operations beyond Cuba. Hunt and Sturgis would both be speculated to have been conspirators in John Kennedy's murder. theorized to have been two of the three tramps pictured in Dallas on the day of the assassination, as you can see on screen. And finally, the two would reunite once again in the 1970s, both under the Nixon White House, this time as Watergate plumbers. Frank Sturgis was only one of an increasing cast of so-called CIA assets emerging in the Florida, Louisiana, Caribbean milieu in the late 50s and early 1960s. Also famously ferrying guns to Castro was none other than a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Rubenstein, known later of course as Jack Ruby, the man who would kill Lee Harvey Oswald and subsequently go insane. Earlier in the late 1950s, Ruby was working as a gunrunner to Batista's forces on behalf of his mob-associated friends, such as Havana casino manager Louis McWillie, who managed Meyer Lansky's Tropicana casino in Havana. The young Ruby was also allegedly, according to future CIA-Mafia liaison John Roselli, close to Santo Trafficante Jr., while he was working out of Havana, stating the following, that, quote, Ruby was hooked up with Trafficante in the rackets in Havana, end quote. This is critical, as Santo Trafficante would, as we will see later, become the CIA's major mafia connection for dope smuggling from Laos and Burma during the 1960s. But maybe most interestingly, according to Peter Dale Scott, 5 or so years later, following Ruby's conviction in the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald days after the slaying of JFK in 1963, Ruby told a friend from his jail cell that, quote, they're going to find out about Cuba, they're going to find out about the guns, find out about New Orleans, find out about everything, end quote. Luckily for his conspirators, but maybe not so luckily for Ruby himself, he would shortly be unable to testify about this New Orleans conspiracy, as he would mysteriously go insane shortly after his arrest for the murder of JFK's murderer. This bout of insanity was brought on right after a mysterious visit from MK Ultra affiliated CIA psychologist Dr. Louis Jolyon Jolly West, but that's a story for another time. What is made clear from Ruby's involvement in pre-revolutionary illegal activities and gun running to Cuba was that New Orleans and mob boss Carlos Marcello's domain of Louisiana as a whole would become arguably the second most important node in the anti-Castro and subsequent Kennedy conspiracies after the South Florida area. Also in this circle, transporting guns to pre-revolutionary Cuba were the boys associated with the Louisiana Civil Air Patrol, an ostensibly civilian appendage to the full-blown Air Force. The particular group of pilots associated with the Louisiana Air Patrol were particularly spooked up and increasingly associated with CIA gun and drug running throughout the 1970s and 80s. Out of this patrol, you have the leader of the group, David Ferrie, an eccentric man and by many accounts, a psychopath and a pedophile. Ferrie was, according to Daniel Hopsicker, and maybe most famously Jim Garrison, a CIA asset, operating in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. In the mid-1950s, Ferrie would recruit a teenaged Barry Seal, who would eventually become a long-standing CIA pilot, who would fly for the agency in the Bay of Pigs invasion, reportedly also in Laos for Air America, and later would become the most prolific drug smuggler in US history, flying between Colombia, Central America, and famously the dirt airstrips in tiny Mena, Arkansas, in the state of a young Governor Bill Clinton. Barry Seal was believed to have gotten his start with the agency, flying guns to Cuban forces in the late 50s. You may be noticing that as we get closer to Cuba, we are also getting very close to the circle that has been suspected by many of killing John F. Kennedy in 1963. This becomes even more apparent when we consider that David Ferrie had also recruited another teenage pilot into the Civil Air Patrol around the same time as Barry Seal in the mid-1950s. When Barry Seal served in Civil Air Patrol under David Ferrie, he served alongside none other than Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who would be fingered as Kennedy's assassin. On screen are two pictures. The first is one of the Louisiana Air Patrol during a training program sometime in 1955. Former Civil Air Patrol members have identified both David Ferrie and Lee Harvey Oswald as both in this photo. Now, according to Daniel Hopsicker in his book Barry and the Boys, Barry Seal had also been a member of Ferrie's troop around the same time that Oswald had been. This brings us to the second photo provided by Daniel Hopsicker in his book, of a 16-year-old Barry Seal on July 23, 1955, on his way to a CAP training camp, also led by David Ferrie. Could this have been the same camp that Oswald was pictured in? Both Barry Seal and Oswald were born in 1939, making them both 15 or 16, and both would have likely joined CAP around the same time. Interestingly, Barry would go directly from Civil Air Patrol to gun running for the CIA in Cuba later that decade. Lee Harvey Oswald would similarly go straight from the CAP to serving as a Marine, posted at a top-secret U-2 spy plane base in Japan in around 1957, an unusual assignment for an allegedly mediocre soldier and pilot. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the CIA spy plane program was at the same time directed by future Deputy Director of Plans Richard Bissell, the same man who would be in charge of planning the Bay of Pigs invasion by Allen Dulles a year or two later. But zooming back in for a second, the future alleged assassin of JFK was, for a time in the 1950s, in close proximity to Barry Seal and Dave Ferrie, who would both later fly arms to Cuba. Later flying alongside them was Jack Ruby, the man who would later assassinate Oswald. This may be the coziest circle of future prominent Kennedy assassination figures throughout the whole map, and they were all meeting before Kennedy even got into office in 1961. But more prescient for the moment is maybe the question as to why the CIA was supporting Castro, a future communist, who at the time surrounded himself with avowed Marxists, such as his brother Raul and his military advisor Che Guevara. The official explanation, which I find hard to accept, is that Castro kept his communist leanings close to his chest, and duped the State Department and by proxy the CIA into thinking that despite his brother and closest advisor being avowed communists, that he himself was not, and that he was actually anti-communist. And sure, in the early days he did make overtures that he was strictly not a communist.
There is not communism or Marxism in our ideas.
This is the explanation of figures such as Frank Sturgis, who claimed that he assisted Castro until it became evidently clear that he was a communist, sometime in 1959. This explanation is further bolstered by the idea that the CIA was simply hedging their bets in the ongoing revolution, befriending Castro while maintaining support for Batista in order to remain on good terms with whichever faction ended up winning. I find this explanation difficult to contend with. I just find the idea that the CIA would disregard Fidel's closeness to communists unrealistic. What I will leave you with is the fact that we cannot deny that the CIA did benefit in certain key ways from Castro's rise to power in Cuba, and that these consequences, whether intended or unintended, did have a significant impact on the agency's future legacy. Firstly, the CIA would absorb a massive contingency of Cuban exiles that shared many of the same core values as the agency. These Cuban exiles would go on to fight in the Bay of Pigs, but more importantly, would become the main CIA contractors in charge of the agency's dirty work across the world, be it dope smuggling in Southeast Asia and Latin America, or assassinations around the globe. These Cuban assets would continue to pop up across the rest of the CIA's Cold War operations. Secondly, the subsequent anti-Castro operations led by the CIA under Eisenhower and Kennedy would provide a perfect opportunity to bolster the agency's paramilitary capabilities and to train the future class of paramilitary experts that would operate in the upcoming Southeast Asian wars. Legendary CIA paramilitary experts would emerge from the Miami JM Wave anti-Castro operations, as we will see. These include names such as Ted Shackley, Thomas Kleins, Felix Rodriguez, and David Morales. They would all get their start training Cuban exiles in South Florida, and they would all really hit their stride working counterinsurgency in Laos in the upcoming decade. With the ousting of Batista and the emergence of the anti-Castro craze, the CIA had gained the pretense to develop future paramilitary capabilities, which would be brought to bear in Laos and Vietnam in the upcoming years. And finally, as we will see, the rise of Castro led to the further integration of the CIA and the Havana mobsters, now back in the United States. Although it was not only the CIA that would become closer to the mob throughout the 1960s, but also the entire political establishment, as the newly returned mafia was to form a prominent piece of the US political puzzle for the next decades to come. Speculation aside, what was true is that by 1959, Fidel Castro had cemented his control of Cuba and appointed several avowed communists to key posts in his provisional government, most famously Che Guevara as governor of the central bank. Throughout 1959 and 1960, he immediately got to work nationalizing the foreign-owned property throughout the island, including the United Fruit Company's plantations and Rockefeller-owned Jersey Standard Oil refineries. As a final act, Castro nationalized the American-owned casinos and resorts, and banned prostitution and gambling, dealing a critical blow to American mobsters and Meyer Lansky's National Crime Syndicate. Losing those assets in 1959 sent the mob into a frenzy, and propelled the formal marriage between the National Crime Syndicate and the Central Intelligence Agency, as I stated before. This marriage, which had been teased throughout the 1940s and 50s, would make the 1960s and 70s some of the most profitable decades for both organizations, especially as massive amounts of dope began to flow out of Laos and Burma. Importantly, the Havana mobsters had begun to diversify their assets long before Castro's official nationalization push. Meyer Lansky, often considered the man behind the curtain of the national mafia and a major silent partner in most of the Cuban casinos, had begun to build a new gambling empire both in Nevada and eventually in the Bahamas. As his Havana casinos were lost by 1960, he intensified his activities in the northern archipelago, soon calling the Bahamas his own fiefdom. The Bahamas would quickly emerge as a new central node for racketeering, gambling, and maybe most importantly, offshore banking, which would often see the intersection of CIA and Mafia interests, as we will see shortly. Alongside Meyer Lansky was Santo Trafficante Jr., another mob boss significantly affected by Castro's seizure of power, and soon to become the CIA's main point man in the global narcotics trade. Trafficante would be put to use by the CIA as their major narcotics smuggler within La Cosa Nostra, especially as the American mafia figure was rumored to bring in Southeast Asian heroin throughout the 1960s and 70s as the US's involvement in Vietnam grew. In time for the new Get Castro craze, the CIA had already been set up in Miami since the mid-1950s. Their agent Paul Helliwell, the CIA's Caribbean banker and paymaster, and a critical link between the opium fields of Southeast Asia and the criminal underworld of South Florida, would lay the groundwork for the massive expansion of spooks in the Sunshine State. Helliwell famously hosted the Thai consulate in Miami out of his law offices, and according to Penny Lernoux in her book In Banks We Trust, he helped the corrupt Thai generals and Taiwanese interests involved in the Burmese opium trade launder their dirty funds into Miami real estate. The registered foreign lobbyist for the Thai consulate, by the way, in the Sunshine State, was another lawyer close to Helliwell, named James Rowe, a law partner of none other than Tommy the Cork. In the footage on screen, we can see an interesting intersection. This footage, filmed by Lady Bird Johnson in 1955. Here in this footage, we see China lobbyist Tommy the Cork, Thai consul with Paul Helliwell, James Rowe, and future President Lyndon Johnson looking very chummy, maybe best illustrating the overlap of these networks with the real centers of American power. As for the CIA's Paul Helliwell, he represented the agency's foothold in the increasingly critical locale of Miami. There he would remain a critical CIA paymaster, as the agency would open the JM Wave station in the early 1960s, their largest spy station on domestic soil, and at the time in the entire world. This would all come to a head in late 1959, at the tail end of President Eisenhower's second term, when Vice President Richard Nixon headed the first secret task force planning the overthrow of the new Cuban leader Fidel Castro. According to reports, and to Eisenhower himself later, this task force was devised by Nixon and Allen Dulles behind the president's back. He was only made aware of the Cuba operations when he specifically asked Dulles to begin planning, sometime in 1960. Little did Ike know, the CIA and his VP had been hard at work planning an anti-Castro operation for nearly half a year, really putting into perspective how unaccountable the CIA had become under Eisenhower's hands-off presidency. The early planning of the anti-Castro operations were reportedly small in scale, only planning to train and deploy some 30 Cuban exiles onto the island to foment a popular uprising against Fidel. The early stages of the planning were clearly inspired by the Guatemalan operation in 1954, which only ended up employing a coup group of about 150 Guatemalan exiles. When Ike asked for a rigid policy against Cuba from his CIA director, the scope of the project was expanded massively, with the president's implicit approval. This implicit approval became explicit on March 17, 1960, as Eisenhower gave the official green light. From this point on, the CIA's Cuba program would balloon out of control, and eventually come to house and train the main cadre of CIA agents and contract workers that would undertake their future secret wars in Southeast Asia, and help usher in the narco funding that would define the next decades of the agency. According to many, it was also within this locale that the future killers of President Kennedy would be trained. For the time being, however, in the late 1950s, until he started seriously campaigning for the presidency in mid-1960, Vice President Richard Nixon would remain the key White House representative on the Bay of Pigs Planning Committee. Nixon himself, by 1959, had already built substantial ties to the South Florida milieu, and through associates came into close proximity to the organized crime elements that would come to be the epicenter of the Anti-Castro Operations. Through his longtime friend, Cuban-American real estate developer and shady financier Charles Bebe Rebozo, whom according to Henrik Kruger, he had allegedly met all the way back in 1943 while working for the Office of Price Administration during the war, Nixon had ingrained himself into the South Florida scene, buying property in Key Biscayne, which would become his quote-unquote winter White House when he'd become president. Rebozo also came to advise Nixon on investments in Batista's Cuba before the Cuban Revolution. Therefore, Castro's nationalization of U.S. assets personally affected Nixon. And from 1959 onwards, the CIA itself quickly began to roll out programs to support the vice president's efforts. Of course, I have to mention that Rebozo and Nixon's, I'll say cozy relationship, has led to persistent rumors pointing at a potential gay affair between the two men. Over the years, there has been plenty of anecdotal evidence from journalists and close associates of Nixon's that he and Rebozo's relationship extended beyond a simple friendship. However, for our purposes, this alleged gay affair gains an additional dimension when we consider the fact that Rebozo had long-standing ties with organized crime figures, most prominently Santo Trafficante Jr. and Meyer Lansky. Therefore, if we are to run with this Rebozo-Nixon secret lover story, then what we have here is a similar situation of mob blackmail as I explored in the Blue Suite episode of the history of the CIA. There, of course, the target was J. Edgar Hoover, by, once again, Lansky Associates. This type of blackmail would not be unprecedented, and if it was in fact real, it would have allowed organized crime in the Miami area to significantly influence Nixon's decision-making, especially as far as the narcotics trade and anti-Castro operations were concerned. We're already running long today, so I don't really have time to get too much further into these details, but I just thought I would put that out there just so we understand that that relationship might exist as well. Interestingly, Rebozo's circle ran closely with the CIA, which was also starting to build a significant foothold in his native Florida during this period. According to a September 12, 1958 article in the newspaper The Tallahassee Democrat, Bebe Rebozo is mentioned by name as a member of the bipartisan committee that sought to attract the 1960 Democratic and Republican National Conventions to Miami Beach, Florida. On this committee, with Rebozo, was none other than Miami lawyer Paul Helliwell, the CIA's paymaster and connection to Southeast Asia through Miami. In the article, it notes that Helliwell was to chair the committee, and that he is described as a, quote, fine friend to the president, and he has been very active in Mr. Eisenhower's recent campaigns, end quote. In fact, it was partially thanks to Helliwell's efforts on behalf of the Florida Republican Party that Eisenhower won the state in both 1952 and 56, a state that had gone to Truman in 1948 by over 15 points. Despite Helliwell's perceived closeness to Ike and his reported role in turning Florida red, the 1960 Republican National Convention would end up taking place in Chicago, not Florida. Nonetheless, Helliwell's closeness to Rebozo shows a melding of worlds between the Nixon camp and the CIA and mob underworld in Miami. Nixon would remain intimately connected to this power center, especially as he would turn to these covert channels for support in his later presidential runs, and his continued hidden relationship with Paul Helliwell and his future banking empires. Furthermore, Helliwell's close relationship to Eisenhower and prominent position in the Florida GOP also reflects the full integration of these intelligence mob elements into the apparently respectable politics of Florida. According to author Alan Block, Helliwell was called in those days Mr. Republican for his foundational influence in the Florida Republican Party. In Florida, these connections and intersecting relationships would undoubtedly bleed into Nixon's planning of the Bay of Pigs operation, An operation that was in the best interest of the CIA, the mob, and of course the Florida Republicans, many of which lost land and investments in Cuba. From this nexus, the CIA-Mafia connection would be formally brought together, as we will see in detail in the next chapter. Because as it would have it, the Bay of Pigs invasion would not take place under Eisenhower, as his second term came to an end in late 1960, before the plans had been put into motion. According to Hugin, the original timetable for the Castro assassination program sought to have the leader killed before the November election in order to help Nixon's chances in the election. However, to the dismay of the hardliners and Nixon boosters, the assassination did not come, and John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States. Importantly, however, Dwight Eisenhower would leave Americans with one somewhat ironic lasting legacy, that being the popularization of the concept of the military-industrial complex. In his farewell address on January 17, 1961, days before President John Kennedy would enter the White House, Eisenhower warned the American people of the unwelcome influence of the permanent arms industry on the politics and policies of the United States. He claimed the following.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society.
Now, I claim that this was an ironic warning, as Eisenhower did little to quell the massive increase in nuclear weapons spending under his New Look policies during his presidency. Also, Eisenhower did little to reduce actual military spending, instead simply funneling that spending towards client states in Southeast Asia, in the form of overwhelming military aid. And somehow, despite these gifts to the growing military-industrial complex, it did prove too little for some, such as the Rockefellers, who funded the Special Studies Project, calling for limited war spending. This would come in the upcoming decade, as alongside Cuba, Vietnam would emerge as a key policy issue under the incoming Kennedy administration. Consequently, some have interpreted Eisenhower's farewell address as an admission of guilt for his role in allowing the entrenchment of military Keynesianism within American society. But there is another way of interpreting this speech that I personally ascribe to. Throughout Eisenhower's presidency, his administration had largely allowed the intelligence apparatus, run by the Dulles brothers, to run without significant barriers. This in turn led to significant results, such as the successful regime change operations in Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, Laos in 1958 and 59, and in the Congo in 1960. Ike, having witnessed these imperialistic successes by his spy agency, was likely also optimistic about the pending Bay of Pigs invasion plans, which were coming together as he was giving this speech. Could Eisenhower have been secretly stating his realization that covert operations were a cheaper and more effective option than overt military interventions? Could Ike have been telling the incoming Kennedy to allow his CIA to do the heavy lifting abroad? Either way, the JFK White House, despite purging Allen Dulles as director and some of his old guard, would employ the CIA to full effect in post-Bay of Pigs Castro assassination programs. And this, of course, brings us to the Kennedy White House and the climactic conclusion of the pursuit of a formal rollback policy in Southeast Asia. Thank you all so much for watching as always, and please, if you enjoyed today's program, leave a like and a comment down below letting me know what you thought. It does help a lot with the algorithm. The video you watched today first aired to my Patreon subscribers on June 5, 2024. I would not have been able to dedicate the time and effort away from friends and family producing this video without their generous support. Patreon supporters, as always, get all the videos from the upcoming season early, before they premiere here on YouTube. So throughout the past year when I was quiet on YouTube, the Patreon subscribers were eating. On screen now are the names of my producer tier patrons. As you know, when you watch Eyes Wide Open on YouTube, it is always ad-free. I do not make any money off of YouTube ads, which allows me to say what I want, and not worry about keeping my content within the confines of YouTube's stringent monetization policy. That said, I am completely dependent on individual support to do the work that I do. So as always, to my Patreon subscribers, thank you. Next week, we are finally going to Cuba with a deep dive into the infamous Operation 40. What was Operation 40? Was it really a CIA assassination squad? All that and much more next time on Eyes Wide Open. I have some really interesting stuff to share in that video, some memos that I don't believe have surfaced really anywhere else that give some unique insights into Operation 40 as a unit and how the CIA employed them. So that's all I've got for today, though, folks. So thank you so much for watching, as always. A like goes a long way. A comment, I read all the comments. I love hearing from you guys. But as always, remember to keep your eyes wide open. Take care.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our societies.